That's beautiful. That would sound good on the 4th of July, wouldn't it? I got a little sad news for you. Santa will be missing a reindeer this year. Tammy White killed Dancer. She heard of bow season and flintlock season and gun season, and so she thought it was car season. She got her a deer. Well, God bless you all this morning. Appreciate you so much. Isn't God wonderful? Real. He's a Savior. And if you bear with me for a few moments, I'd like to talk about the greatest man that ever lived. And no, I'm not talking about myself. I don't know if that conceited. I'm talking about Jesus. And a lot of things that surrounded Jesus that's written elsewhere. It's chapter 2 of St. Matthew. Some of this I may have preached last Christmas. I don't know. Now in first 3 verses. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. When Herod the king heard that these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Jesus, everywhere he went, and even at his birth, there was a great, you might say, monopoly around him. Everybody didn't love him. Everybody wasn't glad to hear that he is born or going to be born. But there's one man in particular simply hated the thought of it. And there's a lot of things written in history that's not in the Bible, as you'll read about Alexander the Great and Napoleon and all those things. But records were kept in history of the people that surrounded Jesus that sometimes we don't hear about. And Caesar was king of Rome, or he ruled Rome. He was the emperor. But the king Herod in Jerusalem, he was just a puppet for Caesar. He never did anything without Caesar, and he was afraid of Caesar. And he wanted that position that he held. Now, before he had this position as king, his father, Herod Antipater, had this job before him. He was a wicked man also, but the wickedness of his son and the cold-heartedness of his son, it outdid what his father did. So when Caesar was looking for a new king, he didn't have to look far, because it pleased him to have such a wicked man in Jerusalem. It pleased him to have somebody that would tolerate nothing out of the ordinary in Jerusalem. And so he pretty well could handle Rome and stay there, knowing that he had a man that would kill somebody, even if they mentioned a fact of they was going to try to overthrow Herod. That's how paranoid he was. He was a man that was of wickedness of the world. He was 69 years old when Jesus was born, and his body was deteriorated. He only lived about 2 years afterwards that Jesus was born. But he was so eat up with power, he was so eat up with fear that someone was going to take his kingdom, that he was scared to death about this little baby that was going to be born in Bethlehem of Judea. He didn't know much about it, but there were things that he did know through the prophecy. Whether he believed them or not, it was enough to get him stirred up. And there were 5 things that were prophesied in Micah and Daniel and some of the other Old Testament people. One was that there'd be a great star shining. 2, he'd be born in Bethlehem, the city of David. 3, he'd be a descendant of David. 4, men will travel to see him. And 5, his mother would be a virgin. Now, he knew some of these things, but he didn't know them all. But he knew enough, not even though he was an unbeliever, he was so paranoid about losing his kingdom. Like a lot of folk today have got a little something, they're so paranoid about losing it. They don't take time out to worship this Son of God, who is Jesus Christ, that was born by Virgin Mary, and then he was crucified on the cross. But Jesus was born that day, and yet when he was born, Herod had no idea where he was. Herod lived in Jerusalem. He could sit in his castle and see almost all of Jerusalem. Daily he could watch the Jews come in and out of the temple. And when they had a season of worship, he could see them come in 600 yards from him. The people of God were worshiping, but he had nothing to do with them. He didn't want anything to do with them. And certainly he didn't want to hear about a great Jew that was going to come that might take his kingdom away from him. And so he sent out a decree that this is not going to happen. And he wanted to know where Jesus was. And the strange thing about it was, when Jesus was born, on the eighth day, they brought him to the temple of Jerusalem to be circumcised. When they brought him to the temple of Jerusalem to be circumcised, Caesar was sitting within 600 yards of the temple of where Jesus was brought on his eighth day to be circumcised. Again, he was brought back on it when it was the 40th day, when 40 days had passed. That was to anoint him and dedicate him solely unto God. And there were two people in that temple that had a vision of God, had a vision of Jesus being born. They knew who he was. One of the men that I mentioned last Sunday, I think, talking about it briefly, one of them, he simply wanted to live to see Jesus come. He asked not to die until he could lay his eyes upon Jesus. And this was a man of prophet, Simeon, and then there was a prophetess named Anne. And they both were in the temple that 40th day when Jesus came to be dedicated to God. The place was full, packed out, but out of that crowd came two people, an old man and an old woman, because Anna had been married for a few years. But after that, her husband passed away. She stayed in the temple, and that's where she lived. And she served God night and day. Now, if you don't think it's important to go to church today, it was important then, and it's important now. She never left the temple. She served God and fasted all that time. And so she too was waiting for that time when the Jesus would come into the world and that name would become a household word. But they walked out through the crowd. Mary and Joseph had never met them. They didn't know them. They never seen them before, and probably maybe casually seen them and not know it in the house of worship with that many people. But when they walked up to Joseph and Mary, and Simeon looked at them and saw baby Jesus in Mary's arms, he walked up and immediately, I guess, asked, "Can I hold the baby?" That's what we do. Now, some people, you know, if you were in a big crowd in a mall in Cincinnati, and a strange man walked up to you, and you had a little child in your hand, and you didn't know him, and he said, "I want to hold that baby."